The Victorian Era.
It all started year 1837 and ended on year 1901. The Victorian era was the period of Queen Victoria's reign. It was a long period of peace, prosperity, refined sensibilities, and national self-confidence were retained. The fields of social history and literature often refer to the Victorian era as Victorianism, especially when discussing the attitudes and culture of the later two-thirds of 19th century. Queen Victoria was the first English monarch to see her name given to the period of reign. The Victorian age was characterized by rapid change and developments in nearly every sphere, from advances in medical, scientific, and technological knowledge to changes in the population growth and location. Over time, this rapid transformation deeply affected the country's mood. An age that began with confidence and optimism, leading to economic boom and prosperity, eventually gave way to uncertainty and doubt regarding Britain's place in the world. Today, we associate the 19th century with the Protestant work ethic, family values, religious observation, and institutional faith. For the most part, 19th century families were large and patriarchal. They encouraged hard work, respectability, social difference, and religious conformity. But the view of 19th century life was valid. It was frequently challenged by contemporaries. Women were often portrayed as either Madonnas or worse. Yet, increasing educational and employment opportunities gave many a role outside the family. Politics were important to the Victorians. They believed in the perfection of their evolved representative government and in exporting it throughout the British Empire. This age saw the birth and spread of political movements, most notably socialism, liberalism, and organized feminism.
The Victorian novel. The novel was dominant genre in Victorian period, created by Charles Dickens. Victorian era was the great age of the English novel. It was realistic, thickly plotted, crowded with characters, and long. The novels of Charles Dickens, full overflowing with drama, humor, and endless variety of vivid characters and plot compilation. Nonetheless, is best known for Vanity Fair in 1848. Which wickedly satirizes hypocrisy and greed. Characteristics of Victorian literature are likely similar both because the artists were inspired both by the art that came before them and the events occurring during the time that they were working. So something can seem Victorian but not have been written in the Victorian era, or something written in the Victorian era might not actually seem Victorian. For example, Charlotte and Emily Bronte wrote Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights in what would be considered the Victorian era, but those novels have much more qualities and romantic period. The most well-known Victorian writer was Charles Dickens. He wrote a lot of novels about the struggles of the poor and the battle between right and wrong. His characters were really vivid but not terribly nice, so it's pretty obvious from the get-go who's good, who's bad, who can be reformed, and who we can't. Dickens himself had to leave school early to work in a factory to support his family after his father was sent to jail, so it's not really surprising that a lot of his works, including Oliver Twist or David Copperfield, having a protagonist who are good people that fall into bad circumstances that they don't deserve. It seems like that's something he could really relate to personality.
Non-fiction. Among the Victorian masters of non-fiction were the great Whig historian Thomas Maquiling and Thomas Carlyle, the historian social critic and prophet whose rhetoric thundered through the age. Influential thinkers included John Stuart Mill, the great liberal scholar and philosopher, Thomas Henry Huxley, a scientist and popularizer of Darwinian theory, and John Henry Cardinal Newman, who wrote the earnest of religious philosophy and education. The founder of communists, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, refreshed and wrote their books in the free environmental of England. Poetry. The preeminent poet of the Victorian age was Alfred Lord Tennyson. Although romantic in the subject matter, his poetry was tempered by personal melancholy in its mixture of social certitude and religious depth and reflected the age. The poetry of Robert Browning and his wife Elizabeth Barrett Browning was immensely popular, though Elizabeth was more venerated during their lifetimes. Browning is the best remembered for his superb dramatic monologues. In the middle of the 19th century, the pre-Raphaelites, led by the painter-poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti, sought to revive what they judged to be the simple, natural values and techniques of medieval lights and arts. 20th century shares a pessimistic view in their poetry, but Hausmann's well-constructed verse is rather more superficial. The great innovator among the late Victorian poets was the Jesuit priest Gerard Manley Hopkins.
Out of the significant contributions of the Victorian era, 10 of the most widely known are given emphasis that really took part and have been adopted by today. The contributions of this era are the following that will be mentioned. First, the free education for all. In 1870, the Elementary Education Act brought into English law that basic state education would be provided for free for every child under the age of 10, followed by an Act of Parliament 4 years later which made school attendance mandatory for children. The second one, the universal suffrage. The first and second Reform Acts in England together extended the vote to all males in the country, removing property restrictions that previously set the eligibility criteria, while the Representation of the People Act in 1884 further extended these rights to include rural areas. The third one, first illustrated weekly newspaper. The Illustrated London News was founded in 1842 as the world's first weekly newspaper. This had tremendous impact on becoming the first regular source of news and information to the people at large, essentially making this the first technology of mass communication to make news accessible. The fourth one, Darwinism, the evolution. It was during the Victorian era that Charles Darwin set sail aboard the Beagle. While Darwin's findings and the resulting theory can certainly not be ascribed to Queen Victoria or her rule directly, there was an indirect influence from the general social direction of the day. Evolutionary ideas, such as common descent and the transmutation, have existed. The fifth one, operational species, the work week. In 19th century, Victorian England was marked by increasing industrialism, where time was money and efficiency became increasingly significant. Specialization in production and individual labor become as common as the rural means of production, in which the family used the means of production, consumption, and socialization.
Extension of the popular vote to the people. With the coming of industrialization and the formalization of a social economy, Queen Victoria ensured that the evolution of a modern society, in part defined by a democratized economy and relatively equal access to success, was nurtured under her rule. Development of the middle class. In the late 18th century, with the term social class first entered the English lexicon, the concept of a middle class within that structure was also becoming important. Pax Britannica. Victoria took an active involvement in the affairs of state and was from being a figurehead as queen. She strongly believed that Britain should rule as much as the world as an empire and she worked with two prime ministers to achieve this. Within her political legacy is the Pax Britannica, a British peace that resulted from the foreign policy goals at that time. In literature, novelists and poets, writers of the Victorian era began to move away from the stiffer social conventions of the Romanticists and entered the realm of satire and commentary. Contribution in architecture, Gothic renewal, also known as Victorian Gothic or New Gothic. This style began 100 years before Victoria took the throne, but achieved its peak and greatest use during her reign.